Oddball Show features content intended for mature audiences. If you'd like to view a content warning before listening, please check out the episode description. The views put forth by our hosts and our guest reflect the speaker's opinions and not the official stance of Oddball Foundation. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy the show.
Hey everybody, welcome to Oddball Show. My name is Jason Wright, and today our guest is Ann Bracken. Ann Bracken has worn many hats throughout her life. She's the author of Crash, a memoir of Overmedication and recovery, as well as several other books of nonfiction and poetry. She's a former special education teacher, and she currently serves on the board of directors of an organization called Volunteers in Psychotherapy. She's also an editor for the Maryland literary magazine, The Little Patuxent Review. I'm so excited to welcome Ann to the show to discuss her memoir, hear some poetry, her current and former projects, and how her life has informed her creative work. Ann Bracken, welcome to Oddball Show.
Thank you, Jason. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm really thrilled to have you on the show. I appreciate, Jim Gottstein, who was on the show. He recommended to have you on the show, and thank you for coming on. I know that you are an author at Madden America, and you've just written Crash, a memoir of over-medication recovery, but you're also a poet as well. Yes. So let's dig in. So Oddball Show usually talks a lot about mental health advocacy, and this actually ties in together, but we're also, Oddball Magazine is a poetry literary magazine. Oddball Show has had tons of poetry performances on the show, tons of poets on the show. Oddball Foundation's board is a lot of our members are poets. Love poetry. It's a gift, I think, to be able to write poetry. I really do think it's a gift. So let's dig into poetry before we get into everything. So, Ann, when did you start writing, and when did you realize you were like, I'm good at this?
Well, I actually started writing back in the 90s when I was in the midst of a very severe experience of depression. So like a lot of people, that poetry was a natural way to express myself and dig into the darkness and talk about, the depths of what I was feeling. And at some point, one of my cousins who lives in California sent me a CD from a poet named David White, who had done a talk called The Poetry of Self-Compassion. And she said, I think this will really help you. So I started listening to it. And up to that point, I had never really studied poetry at all. I majored in speech pathology in college. I studied special ed in graduate school. So, I was not very involved in poetry. And when David started talking and read a poem by Mary Oliver about leaving your house on a wild night, and all of the branches were littering the road, and everybody was begging you to stay and clutching at your ankles, but you had to leave because you had to save the only life you could save. That's when I said, she knows what I'm experiencing. And
that's a metaphor for something else.
Yes, it was poetry. It was that CD. And I've given that CD to so many people and listened to it hundreds of times, probably myself, because I just feel like there was so much value in what he had to say about entering the darkness and the gifts that you can find in the darkness.
It's time to go into the dark where the night has eyes to recognize its own. There you can be sure you are not beyond love.
And I had all these doctors telling me that it was just a chemical imbalance. And I kept saying, so you mean to tell me that one day I'm fine, and then the next day I have a chemical imbalance and I have to take drugs forever? And they said, yes. And I said, that doesn't really make any sense to me. I just don't understand this. But, I kept hitting a wall with the doctors. So luckily I began exploring poetry, and I found out about an organization called the National Association for Poetry Therapy.
Huh. Okay.
And I contacted them, and I actually went through their training program.
Oh, so wow.
That's how I took a deep dive into poetry, and I didn't come in through the literary angle. I came in through the therapeutic angle, through what poetry can do for your life. So I've always seen poetry as something that's very practical. It's not esoteric. To me, it's practical.
I love that. And I think that is such a refreshing thing when it comes to poetry, because some people write with this feel this emptiness, just this feeling of nothing behind it. Some people write for esteem, and some people write to get their name out there and everything. And for me, it was a act of survival. For me, it was my number one thing that I leaned on when I couldn't talk to anyone about what I was going through. It was my best friend at points. It was my sounding board, and not all that stuff got published. I mean, it's all in my notebooks, but it got me through a lot. And you know, when absolutely feeling devastated, you know, just writing something out and getting it out there, very similar to maybe, you know, talking to a friend or something. But when you don't have that friend and you have your notebook, it's beautiful. And I love that about poetry. And I love the fact that you don't necessarily have to say, hey, look, I'm sad today, right? But you can say, like, you know, these trees around me are, you know, swelling around me, and, you know, my legs are being, you know, I can't move because I'm stuck. And you look at it like, oh, I get it, you know, I see what you're doing there. Instead of, but, you know, sometimes poetry is quite literal, and that's also the beautiful part of it. You could be like, I'm sad today, and then, like, this is it. So that's like the different forms of poetry that I think is beautiful. Do you think, you know, poetry for you got you into this world of discovery? I don't like to say recovery as much anymore, because I've been thinking about it, like, you know, well, actually I've heard, and I've heard, and I've been told the idea of recovery versus discovery, and the idea of, like, what are we trying to recover here, and what are we trying to discover? And honestly, we're trying to discover our new self and have new experiences. So I'm not gonna be like, oh, what was your, you know, series with discovery like? But I just don't like the word recovery anymore. But anyway, what I don't, that's not that I don't like it. Yeah, anyway, was it, and maybe I can just rephrase it, was it like the poetry and the writing, and also was that what climbed you out of what you were going through at the time? And did you use it as a welcoming tool as you kept on going in your recovery? Sorry.
Yes, I wasn't studying poetry at all at that point. I was just writing about how I felt, to try and capture the depths of despair and the awfulness that I was feeling. And I also used it as a way to hold on. And at the same time I was going through that experience of depression, I had decided that I really wanted to be a writer. So I kept a journal for 4 years, and which I still have. It's over 400 pages.
Oh, wow.
It's a typed journal, and I
Wow.
use that to practice my skills in writing, and also to process what was going on with me at the time.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And I want to dig into this idea. I didn't know of you. I mean, of course, I didn't know of poetry as a therapeutic tool in the actual, like, therapy world. I've always used it as a therapeutic tool. I didn't know there was like an association of therapists who use that professional lens of poetry. So can you dig into that a little bit? Can you tell us a little more
Yes.
about that?
Yes. So I am not a member anymore, mostly because I don't do the work in that same way. But when I was going through my training, there were 2 levels of being a poetry therapist. And one level was the level where I studied, where you had some background in psychology, and maybe you were a teacher or a guidance counselor, and you studied for 2 years, and you had to do 120 hours of supervised clinical work and some kind of poetry work with different groups of people. And you were called a certified, well, they don't call it that anymore. They call it, I forget, they changed the name, but I was designated as a certified poetry therapist. Now I think they call you a poetry facilitator, because
Okay.
they don't want the liability of somebody being called a therapist. If you have a social work degree or you're a psychologist, you can get what they call a registered poetry therapist degree. And then you can work with more at-risk populations, like people in hospitals.
Oh, I see. I want to ask you a question about the art of poetry. For me, back then, and how therapeutic was, and how it is to be a poet trying to be out in the world with a million emerging poets. Do you think that there is a actual detriment to the idea of sending out your work to someone to judge it, to publish it? Or is that like, because for me, I feel like I hate being rejected. It feels terrible. I hate it. Some people wear it as a badge of honor. I'm going to put that on my wall like Stephen King did, but it makes me feel terrible with myself. It's like, what? I love this poem. You don't like this poem? Fuck you, and I always get mad. One time I wrote a scathing email back, and he's like, "You're a poet, aren't you?" It's always the poets who do that. And I was like, I immediately hate you. And like, I'm like, I don't I don't know why. For some reason, for me, I've written, I have Oddball Magazine, oddballmagazine.com, and and I'm the editor and founder of it. And I publish without fail every week. Now, if for the last 10 years. So I have 450 poems or 475 poems up on Oddball Magazine. Now,
Wow.
yeah, great. Because I have a column. So every Tuesday I have to put it out. But here's the thing. If I sent out one of my poems and I got rejected, I would feel bad about it. But people would say, that's the name of the game. That's how you get your name out there. I hate that part about poetry. I hate that part about trying to find a literary agent. I hate that part about, I hate the smoozing. I hate that. It should be kind of about the quality of the work. But the thing is, to the poet who's using it as a note, like, for like therapy or for survival or whatever, they write a poem out and then they say, oh God, I love this poem. This got me through so much. And they send it out to, oh, I'll just make up, and I'm not going to put out a name. You throw it out to somewhere and they just say, you know what, this sucks. And it comes back to the person. We love your poem, but it's not right for our magazine. Or we love your poem, but it doesn't fit our editor's cup of tea. And sometimes they give you like a wise ass, we love but we were having a bad day when we decided not to, whatever. They tongue in cheek. Couldn't that like affect someone, like make them feel terrible about themselves and be like, fuck it, I don't want to be a writer anymore?
I think it can. I think, I'll just speak for myself. It's been a growth experience to be rejected so often. That was one of the things when I was growing up. I really, wanted approval, particularly from my father. So to be rejected by these other authority figures is still difficult, but it's getting easier. Now I know that, I kind of turn it around in my head, like, okay, I got rejected, but at least I'm sending stuff out. So like, I'm not paralyzed. I don't want to be paralyzed by the rejection. And I served as a reader for Little Patuxent Review for about 3 years, and we would get 400 poem submissions. We could only publish 20 or 25 per issue. So I began to see what it was like to be the reader and to have to judge other people's poetry. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's not good. It just means that it didn't appeal to me as the editor, so I look at it that way. I'm not appealing to this particular person. But then when you hit one and they say, boy, I really like this, I'm going to publish it, but it's hard. Yeah, it's very hard.
And let me ask you a question. How often do you publish poetry that rhymes?
Hardly ever.
I thought so. People don't like rhyming poetry. It has to not rhyme, because people don't seem to gel with rhyming poetry, even if it's very well rhymed. I love rhyming poetry. I think it's great, but I think a lot of people in the poetry world despise rhyming poetry. And why do you think people despise rhyming poetry in your opinion?
Maybe because it evokes what you studied when you were a kid, and you really didn't resonate with poetry when you were studying it. I taught poetry for several years in high school, and I used to use the Billy Collins poem, It's called Introduction to Poetry. Have you ever
Beautiful
read?
poem. The one where he tied up in the chair and beat with
Yes, and you beat
beautiful
it with the
poem.
hose to get the
Yeah,
meaning out of it. Well, all the
yeah,
kids, they got it immediately. They
yeah.
loved it. You know, so I could get them into poetry by making fun of the whole intellectual process. And we didn't so much focus on rhyming poetry as we focused on poetry that could speak to them. And if it had rhyme in it, it had rhyme in it. But I worked with other teachers who would just spend hours and hours teaching kids how to write a sonnet where you have to have a certain rhyme scheme. And
Mm,
that could be another aspect of it.
yeah, yeah. No, I hear
When
what
I
you're
tell
saying.
people I used to be an English teacher, they're like, "Oh God, watch my grammar."
I,
So,
I had an English major, so I can talk to you about Paradise Lost if you want, but I probably can't solve a complex math problem for you. Tomato, tomato. But I did write a poem about statistics, and and someone really loved the fact that I wrote a poem about statistics because I just talked about how shitty I was at statistics, and people loved it. But you were, being it seemed like you went, and everything that you've done, everything that you've gone through, you've benefited from it. You've made yourself like grow from it. There's a lot of growth from like, hey, I write poetry. I'm going to find out about this thing that will help me, move forward. I love this. It seems like you have a lot of experience in a lot of different things. Not just memoirs and not just poetry journals. It sounds like sounds like you've done a lot. And I think I applaud that because sometimes people get in this groove that they can't. So I want to ask you a real question. How do you motivate someone who feels like they can't get out of that depression or can't get out of, just like I'm saying, like the whole sending your poetry? I love this poem, send it out, and it sucks. Or just can't do it. They don't see it. They don't have the confidence. It seems like you've grown from every experience you had. So let me ask you a question. To my audience, how do you get unstuck?
So we talked about this a lot in my poetry therapy training, and we actually read a poem about a train that was stuck. And there was a whole story to it. I don't remember the poem. I just remember the experience of it. And I created an exercise around that poem about how does it feel to be stuck? What is it like to be stuck? Are there any benefits to being stuck? Can you think of a reason why it might be a good thing to be stuck? And then, one of the principles that we learned in poetry therapy, they have a fancy name for it. It's called the ISO principle. But basically, you meet the client or the group where they are. So if everybody in your group is struggling and not able to quite make it to feeling better, then you have to meet them there. You can't go in with a happy I'm successful poem because
Yeah.
they're not going to resonate with that. And you have to be respectful of who you're working with. So I think even acknowledging sometimes it's good to be stuck. Sometimes it's okay. Like you get to look around, maybe you'll see something different while you're sitting there being stuck, and you'll get your momentum, but you're not ready yet. Just, I don't know. I think acknowledging where somebody is, framing it positively, doing something with them so that they feel heard and respected.
So you would say community. I'm saying for me, I would say, it sounds like, actually, I was like, you would say community. You actually didn't say that. But like, I guess meeting someone where they're at is definitely like something to do with someone, but also, is it not just like finding your voice within by finding your tribe, or finding someone who accepts you or listens to you? What is it about isolation that is the constant for people just giving up in the world?
Wow, that's a great question, because I think it's so easy to isolate when you feel really, really desperately depressed. It's, you just don't want to go anywhere, you don't want to do anything. And one thing that I used to do when I felt that way is, and I didn't even know why this worked for me until like a couple of years ago, but we had an Amish farmers market near our house. And so when on my absolute worst days, I would go to the farmers market. And it was just a way to be in a place where people were very alive and
Mm.
people were doing things. They were making pretzels, they were selling cakes, they were cooking lunches, they were, making candy. There was a lot of activity there, and people were living. And I could be around people. I didn't have to talk to anybody. I didn't have to put forth anything, but I could be there almost as a way to take some life into myself. And
Mm.
years later, I realized that the reason I gravitated to the market was because when I was really little, my grandmother owned a stall in a market in Baltimore. And my
Oh,
parents used to grocery shop at the market when I was about 4 years old. So they would take me to the market and leave me with my grandmother, and I would watch all the people, and my grandmother would give me sticky buns and milk, and it was just a great experience. So I think I was looking for that again. The market meant something to me at a very deep level.
wow. That's really interesting. It sounds like you connected with something subconsciously that you bring you joy, even from like, from 4 years old or 5 years old or whenever it was, it brought you joy. I think maybe that's the answer, right? You connect with something that brings you joy. Also connect with a community that
Mm-hmm.
can bring you joy. I feel like I work in mental health, and I feel like one thing that is really big for me is peer support.
Yes.
I think the peer support community is incredible. I think just being able to speak with someone um, who has lived expertise, I'm going to say
Mm-hmm.
that instead of experience, and say like, look, you've been there and I've been there. Um, but also some of the people who are peers are also writing these books, are hitting a major audience, and they have this major lived experience, and you can relate to them as well. So it's either like, I think of like two things of change agency, honestly, as a being going through peer support and everything. There's micro change and then there's macro change. And micro change is maybe having this one-on-one conversation. And me and you are at a park and we're having this conversation. Macro change is writing your book, and getting that out
Right.
to people. Having a podcast and getting that out to people. And giving talks and lectures. That's macro change. That's how you
Mm-hmm.
change people's perspective on a macro level. Um, so I want to talk about Crash. I do want to hear some of your poetry. Go.
Diagnosis. There's something stuck in your affect, and when it lifts, you'll be fine, a doctor said to me. It's that long slide from hopeful to bereft as the gaudy landscape of my life falters in the hallways. Doctors offer their gifts: Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Buspar. 6 weeks of one and 6 weeks of another until the gods of serotonin and dopamine push me back into the light. When my spirit soars with easy smiles and a ready laugh, the doctors shake their heads and mutter, bipolar 2. I lose my vocabulary. I gain 50 pounds. I undress alone in the dark. New drugs tamp me down to some arbitrary normal. Life spreads itself before me, daily postcards of people and plans. I feel nothing except the smooth surface of the picture, unable to enter its world.
But let's just move on to Crash and talk about that for a second. Um, Crash, a memoir of over-medication and recovery. So that's the name of the book. Tell me about the book itself, and just let's talk about that idea of where's the name Crash come from. And I've heard the name Crash in many regards, but what does it mean for Crash, a memoir of over-medication recovery?
Well, one of my cousins actually gave me the title when I said to him, John, I was so over medicated that a car crash saved my life. And he said, that's what you ought to call your book. So that's where the title comes from. But the experience of crashing, I think, could be extended to the whole experience that I had of severe depression and a migraine for 7 years.
Mm.
And what happened to me was I became depressed. I was in my early 40s and I had 2 teenage kids and I was married. I lived in a nice house. I had my own business. And I didn't even know why I was depressed. I didn't know what was wrong. I felt like I had worked on things. I always had a challenging marriage, or at times very difficult, but I felt like, we had worked on things. And then this headache came along and doctors started telling me I was depressed. And I kept saying, no, I have pain. I have this terrible headache. Wouldn't you be depressed if you had a migraine headache like this? So it just sent me down this medical spiral of doctor after doctor and drug after drug and combinations of drugs and outpatient, inpatient, finally electroconvulsive therapy. And along the way, I went to a neurologist, and then he sent me to a headache clinic. And at the headache clinic, they started giving me OxyContin. So I was on OxyContin, some kind of injectable drug, a nasal spray drug. I had, Demerol injectables for what they called the bad days, the really bad days. And then I was taking 4 psychiatric medicines at the same time. So I was severely over medicated. And I have one friend who won't even talk about it with me. She said, I just don't even want to remember what you were like. And I don't remember fully, which is why I relied on my journal, because the drugs impact your memory. Like I was taking Valium for, 7 or 8, 9 years, and that affects your memory, which I didn't know at the time.
Yeah. So, when you were going through this stuff, you have a journal of your experiences. Did that lend to the memoir?
Yes. I always felt like I was going to write something using that journal. And at first, when I first got out of my depression, I was just going to publish the journal. I didn't know anything about publishing or writing, or I was brand new. I was like, I have to tell this story. This is a good story. Well, it didn't go anywhere. And I just put it away. I just saved it for almost 20 years. I carried it around every time I moved and put it in another closet. And but it really informed.
Yeah,
it was special. I knew that it was important. I knew that it was an important piece of my life that I needed to remember. And when I wrote my first book, my poetry book, was when I really went back and mined the journal. So it refreshed my memory for all kinds of things that I had forgotten. Some of them I was glad I had forgotten. And it helped me to write my first book as, based on all those experiences. And then when I wrote the second book, I again went back and mined the journal and took things out of the journal. And in many places, I had been writing down all the drugs that I was taking. So I had that record. It wasn't just my memory. And I don't know, you live in Massachusetts, right?
I do, yeah.
Okay, so I live in Maryland, and I checked the law on getting your psychiatric records. And the only way you can get your psychiatric records is if your doctor, your psychiatrist, gives them to your general practitioner, and then the general practitioner gives them to you. That's the only way that you can get those records. So I knew that I've had the same dentist for like 30 years. And I went to her one day and I said, "Can you give me a copy of all my records?" And she said, "Yes. Why do you want them?" And I said, "Because I want to know all the drugs that I was taking years ago." And so that's how I got the list of
Oh,
all the drugs that I was taking. Because every time I went to the dentist, they'd say, "What medications are you on?" And so I could verify, yes, I took this combination of drugs. You know, it's not just my memory. I have a record of this.
that is so true. Every time you go to a dentist's office, it's very interesting. They ask you exactly what medications you're taking. So that's a really good resource. If you can't get to your doctor, you could ask your dentist because they know the exact same history. Wow.
Yes.
That's a really good point. Um, I was thinking of, I couldn't help but sidetrack my brain when you were talking about journals. And I wrote Journal of a Madman back in 2002. And I looked up because it's up there on my wall there. And I typed it. It was at McLean Hospital and it's binded and everything. And I look at it and I'm like, man, I should do something with that. But honestly, if I look back at some of the stuff that I was thinking and where I was going, it is like it's it's weird to look back where you've come from, but also it's really great to see where you're going at the same time and where you've come from. So from 2002 to 2023, there's been a big growth in my life, but I still look at it. I look at it, I'm like, wow, like,
Right.
you know.
Right.
So it's really great that you have that resource that you ended up digging out and contributing to your memoir.
Yes. One part that was especially important to me, well, there were two parts. When I felt like the only thing that would help me was electroconvulsive therapy, my psychiatrist sent me to a day program at another hospital. And she told me that they would evaluate me to see if I was right for ECT. And so I kept a journal of all those 5 days of going to that hospital. And almost the very first day, I wrote in the journal, "I don't know why I'm here. I don't understand it. I think it's just for the hospital to make money." And that was in the 90s.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
when I got there, I was waiting in the hall to go to a group, and there was a woman who was catatonic
Oh,
standing.
yeah. Yeah.
And there was somebody else who was just kind of wandering around babbling. And I mean, I'm well dressed, I'm coherent, I'm
Mhm.
together, and I'm thinking, I don't belong here. What am I
Yeah.
doing here? This is
Yeah.
not the right place for me. And you can't really say that when you're in a psychiatric environment. So I spent a week there, and they decided that it was okay for me to have ECT.
At any moment when you were in the hospital, were you thinking, wow, these people are, or these people or this environment, this is over medication, this seems wrong, these, the people here aren't being treated good? Did you have any of that kind of insight when you were there?
I did, because I kept saying, I want to talk to the doctor who's going to do ECT. And I was there for at least 3 days before I got to talk to a doctor. And at one point, we had to go to a group. We had to go to a group that they called a feelings group. So we're in the feelings group, and the therapist says to me, "Well, what are your feelings, Ann?" And I said, "Well, I'm feeling frustrated and angry because I've been here for 3 days and I haven't gotten to talk to a doctor."
mm,
And the rest of the group chimes in and starts adding their frustration and anger. And somebody over in the corner, a guy over in the corner, I remember him, he had his feet up on the windowsill and he was leaning back in his chair, and he says, "Well, good luck seeing a doctor, Ann. I've been here for 5 days and I ain't seen no doctor yet." And the rest of
um,
the group just kind of exploded with different feelings. And the therapist kept saying, "Let's get back to the feelings." And we kept
yeah.
saying, anger and frustration are feelings,
Yeah.
and then at some point she says, well, I think the group is over. So
Yeah. And that's sometimes a response to people revolting, not revolting. When patients speak up in a therapy session, whether in a group session, they're like, okay, group's over. And I think
exactly.
that's my experience. Let me ask you a question. When you were in this, how far had you gone in your career by then? Like, how
Well,
far had you gone in like your life? What had you already experienced before the ECT?
oh, okay. So I worked for 5 years before I had my first child. I was a therapist in a public school system. And when I had my first child and then my second, I stayed home. I raised my kids. That was really important to me. And I became a PTA mom and a Girl Scout mom. And I started my own business. I did dressmaking for people, and I taught sewing lessons for about 15 years. So that was my career part. And then towards the end of that time, I started writing, and my ex-husband had a remodeling business, and I started writing promotional articles for him for the Business Journal.
No, I want to tell you, had this all happened when you were hospitalized, before you were hospitalized?
Yes.
And when you were in the hospital, did you just feel kind of like, how'd you feel? Did you feel like you had rights, or that you were worthless, or that all of the, I'm not trying to load you up here. I'm saying, like, no matter, in your experience, all this stuff that you had already experienced, when you were in the hospital for a couple days, did you feel like you had any power whatsoever, or that you had, or you felt like, hey, like, I've experienced all this stuff. I'm educated. I'm smart. I'm together. Or did you feel like you started losing your autonomy, your power, and that kind of stuff?
I did not know at the time, and this is almost 30 years ago, I did not know at the time that there can be serious repercussions for challenging psychiatrists and making too many demands in that kind of environment. I did not know that. And I'm really assertive now, but I realized I was pretty assertive back then too. And I was angry because I'd been sick for so long. And all these doctors kept saying, take these pills, you're going to get better, just one more pill. And I just wanted to die. And the only reason I decided to have electroconvulsive therapy was because I didn't want to kill myself. I couldn't feel anything. And now I think it was, what do they call it? I think it was psychic numbing. I think I couldn't feel anything because of the drugs.
Yeah, yeah.
Kept telling them that, but it didn't connect for them, even though they should have recognized that. So no, I asserted myself, and I was kind of mouthy, and I was angry.
Do you
It
think
worked out. It worked
do you,
out.
do you think do you think that's the right approach when someone's in the hospital, or do you think worse things can happen to them when they're in that hospital setting?
Oh, now that, like I'm reading Rob Wypon's book about involuntary commitment.
Yeah, yeah.
Your consent is not required. I'm like terrified.
I've heard that's a fascinating book, Rob
It's a
Wypon's book.
fascinating book. And I think to myself, I'm just lucky that nobody like strong-armed me at that point. There was one doctor that I spoke to, and I went to him, and he was a real technocrat, and I was terrified of getting ECT, and I didn't want to lose my memory or any of that stuff. And so I remember I was thinking metaphorically even then. So I took a little journal with me, I took a thimble, and I took a picture of my family. And I said to this man, hold out your hands. And so he holds out his hands, and I give him each of those things. And I said, now you're holding my life in your hands, and I want to know if you care about me. And he just said, well, of course I care. I care about all my patients. He
That's
completely didn't,
beautiful.
he didn't get it. And then another doctor who eventually did the ECT said to me, oh, Dr. So-and-so wanted to give you an antipsychotic.
Wow. That's beautiful. That's beautiful that you like metaphorically were like, this is my life and you have my life in your hands. That's wow. That's poetic. And you ever written about that? You ever written a poem about that?
I think it's in a poem, but I'm not sure.
Oh, it's beautiful. I love it. Yeah, I do feel like there is a certain test, if you test the waters too much in a hospital, things can get really bad really quick. I feel like
Yes.
my experience in the hospital has always been, I have always, no matter my accolades, no matter what, I become the patient and the psychiatrist becomes the psychiatrist. And because you want out. So you
Yes.
will do what it
Yes.
takes to get out. And I
Well,
know,
I call it my inner Catholic girl because I was raised as a Catholic and I went to Catholic school for 12 years and I know how to say yes and
mhm.
I know how to be obedient and sit down and be quiet. So even in my journal, I would say, I realized maybe I'm going too far. I need to bring out the inner Catholic, the inner Catholic girl.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sit on this too long because there's so much more to talk about, but I gotta say there is something really scary about being put in isolation in the hospital or being put in restraints or any all that stuff is just really terrifying. And then eventually you just it's a oscillation. I think you kind of capitulate to the idea that you're in the hospital and that you have to get treatment and maybe stuff happens when you get out, but you gotta go along with it or things can get much worse. And that's a scary part. And I think that's maybe what that book's about.
That is scary. And
Yeah,
pardon?
I think that's what the book is trying to highlight is in your consent is not required. Uh,
Yes. Yes.
But so let's talk about Crash again. Let's go back to that because I think that there's a recovery story here, and I want to hear. We talked about the over medication. Let's talk about the recovery. What happened in what was the turning point in your memoir where things you became an advocate, you became a speaker, you became someone who speaks up to let people know about this over medication and the pharmaceuticals and drug companies and stuff like that. When did that turning point happen for you? And can you highlight that?
Well, I think the 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 life turning point happened when I had the two car accidents. I was so over medicated that I swerved across a major highway 5 times and crashed into a guardrail. And I
Wow.
just got out of the car dazed and I was okay. I got back in the car and drove home. I mean, and I ignored it. I think I don't think, I know I was in denial that there was any kind of a problem. And a couple weeks later, I was driving through the city. I lived near Baltimore and I was going to visit my parents. And I was on a road going through the city. And it was a warm January afternoon. The car was nice and warm. I saw a stoplight up ahead. I slowed down. And the next thing I knew, I had an airbag in my chest. And there was smoke filling my car and a man pounding on the window. And
Wow.
I
Wow.
woke up and realized I had crashed into the back of his van.
And that was when you were on all of the pain medicines for the migraines.
Yes,
Is
I
that
was
right?
on all the pain medicine, and I think at that time, I was taking methadone. I had taken MS Contin, which is morphine, and then they switched me to Oxycontin, and then they switched me to methadone.
Yeah, and do you just not remember what happened? Do you think like it was just too much stuff at one time? And it's called crash, but did you just kind of crash from all the meds you were on? Just kind of you crashed because you crashed because you were
I
on too
didn't
much
know it
stuff.
I didn't know it at the time, but that's exactly what it was. And what made me decide to finally write the book was finding out that even in the 90s, when I was taking all those drugs, the doctors knew that you should not combine opioids and Valium together because they can depress your respiration and cause you to really to die.
Oh
Um,
wow.
and I
Wow.
think that's why I had the car accidents. I was over medicated and I was falling asleep. And my daughter will tell me that and I remember this because it was so embarrassing and heartbreaking, but when she was a teenager and I had to drive her places, she would yell at me at every stoplight because she said, "Mom, you're falling asleep." And I fell asleep at every stoplight. I mean, that's really serious.
Yeah, yeah, that is really serious. And I mean, I think that happens a lot.
Yes, it
I think that
does.
happens a lot.
That's why when I heard about the opioid epidemic and I realized that's what had happened to me, I decided to write the book because I thought, by the grace of God, I did not get addicted. Those opioids, number one, they never took away the pain. Number two, they never made me feel good. So I didn't get addicted to them, but I was over medicated. I was numb. I, could have killed somebody else by my car
Absolutely.
accidents.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I thought this is important to talk about. And the way that I recovered from the migraine was when I had that crash, I realized that Western medicine was not going to save me. I'd given Western medicine several years. I
Hmm.
was worse. So a friend of mine told me about an energy healer, and I just said, okay, bring it on.
Hmm. Hmm.
To work with her, and I worked with her for about 4 months, and she would clear my chakras, which I didn't even know what a chakra was. Basically, there's 7 energy centers in your body, and they're related to both physical and emotional properties
Yeah.
of the person. And she would take care of those chakras and make sure they were all operating right, and get things unstuck metaphorically and I guess physically unstuck. And then I worked with the headache doctor to decrease the pain medicine. And at some point, the energy healer told me I needed to take flower essences. And I said, I'm taking methadone, and you want me to take something called a flower essence? And she's like, yes, I do. So I said, okay, I'll take the flower essences. And she said, it's gonna strengthen your energetic field. It's gonna help your spirit. And I'm like, whatever you say. I'm just doing this because the pain was getting less and less. And within 4.5 months, she got me off of all that pain medicine, and the headache went away.
Wow. Wow. And what was going on with your life at the time? Did you notice like things like happening in your life as well after going to the energy healer?
Well, yes, because I think the purpose of the depression was, I said I had a difficult marriage, and
Hmm.
I think the depression exacerbated my ex-husband's verbal abuse, which had
Mm.
been there all along, but it exacerbated it to the point where I could see it, where I knew that it was happening. I knew he wasn't just being a jerk, that it was actually abusive. It was meant to control me and tear me down. And when I didn't have any more pain, there was one more incident of abuse, and I knew the marriage was over, and I knew that I could leave because I didn't have pain and I could work and support myself.
Wow, that's beautiful. So what happened after? So real quick, I do want to vouch for energy healing and how important that could be and how polar difference that is from Western medicine in the way, in my opinion, where what Western medicine for me, is a medication you have to take every single day, every single day. Talk therapy is something maybe you have to go to every week, every week, every week. I'm not saying that's not a bad thing, but I'm saying that when I went to an energy healer recently, I feel so much better. I feel so much clearer. I feel so much I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. I think my energy was healed a little bit, and I think I'm going to go and continually see this person. I think that they were dynamic, and they listened to me, and they let me. They just did things that I didn't understand, but it was healing and beautiful, and a different approach than some
Yeah.
ugly medication like Depakote, or ugly medication like that causes type 2 or tardive dyskinesia or whatever. And yes, I know, like, I understand that there's still the medication part that I'll tell you my truth. Yes, I'm still on medications. It's part of my life because it's part of my part of where I'm at. I can't help it, but it's part of where I'm at. But this other idea of natural healing is beautiful, and I don't think people recognize it, or they think it's like bullshit or not real, or it's hokey. It is not. It is an absolute beautiful science. Whatever craniosacral therapy is what I've been hearing it as, and I think it's a beautiful thing because not only is it therapy, but it's also healing the body. And if you read Bessel van der Kolk, or you talk about Myth of Normal, and you talk about the brain body balance, it's so beautiful. And Bessel van der Kolk says you hold your scars and your body and your pain and you hold your whole life in your body.
Absolutely.
And that energy healer like lets it out. And it's wow, what a weird thing that is. But I kind of also want to dig into the flower essence. Like, what is that? Like, what was that for you?
Somebody named Dr. Bach in England discovered that you could take flowers and distill them in alcohol, and that certain flowers had certain properties. So one flower essence that you might have heard of, because it's very common, is called Rescue Remedy. And I think
I've never heard of it. No,
it's
Rescue Remedy.
Dr. Bach flower essence, and I believe it's made from many different flowers, and it's very good for anxiety.
Beautiful.
So I use it now because I have anxiety over driving on the expressway. I think after 20 years, the feelings finally came up from the car crashes, like the terror was anesthetized and then it got released. And
absolutely.
So now I have to deal with a moderate level of anxiety when I drive. So I just use Rescue Remedy, and I use another essence called 5-Flower, which my healer talks about as being the all-purpose essence. She says you should always have 5-Flower. So whenever I hurt myself or I have a toothache or anything, I use 5-Flower essence.
Oh, that's fantastic. I didn't know that.
There's some essences that help you on a energetic level. They're not only physical, but like they can help you detach from people. Like, one of my things as someone who was a longtime caregiver for my mother, felt responsible for healing my mother, helping my mother. I still feel that responsibility, especially for my own children when they're suffering, even though they're in their 40s now. But my son calls it momming out, but I still very much identify with the mom energy. And, these essences help me to reset my boundaries and, let my kids do their own thing.
I love that. I'm gonna have to look more into that, and maybe we'll put some show notes in there so people might get something from that. Because I really feel like there are, yes, mental health exists, wellness exists, and I don't know. I don't want to make this broad assumption that the DSM-5, blah blah blah, all these disorders, whatever. Yes, they're there, but there is such thing as mental health and wellness, and there's a lot of ways we can be well, like with energy healing or meditation and all these kind of things. I also like some of the magic mushroom, not the magic mushrooms, but the bacopa, the lion's mane, things like that. I think those are very beneficial. I think there's other things that I also think are beneficial for psychiatric healing, and psychedelic healing and things like that. But there's also just something beautiful and relaxing and reviving about an energy healer. So 100% on board with you on that one, Ann. You mentioned your kids, and you published an article in Mad in America. You did 2 articles in Mad in America. Well, you actually did a bunch of them, but ones that I want to talk about. One you just put out on April 20th in 2023. What is informed consent, and what should I know to help my child? Let's talk about that for a second, because I think that's like a really important thing. What is informed consent, and what should I know to help my child? Like when you wrote that, yeah, what is informed consent, and how can someone help their probably, I'm guessing you're thinking of a young adult or someone who's being faced with medications, I'm guessing, right? Informed consent.
Yes, exactly.
Or like hospitalization.
Exactly. Yes, I have a good friend whose daughter has had some psychiatric issues, and another friend whose granddaughter has been in and out of psychiatric hospitals, and neither one of them knew about getting informed consent. And they struggled in talking to the doctors, and they were upset about the drugs that the grandchild and the daughter were put on, but they had no, they had no power, they had no recourse. And I thought, well, one way to help them and hopefully help other people is to write for Mad in America. So they invited me to write this article. I pitched it to them and they said, we'd love it. And the idea of informed consent is that your doctor needs to cover 4 areas with you anytime they recommend a treatment or a drug. So the first area is, what are the possible benefits of this treatment? And then what are the possible negatives of this treatment? And that would be adverse effects. I don't want to call them side effects because they're not off to the side. They are adverse effects that you don't necessarily want. So they need to cover that. Then they need to cover what are the alternatives. If I say I don't want to take these drugs, what are my alternatives? And then lastly, especially with psychiatric drugs, but with many other drugs as well, they need to talk about, what does it look like to stop taking the drug? What is it like to discontinue this medication? And so that's what I wanted to write about and give, this. I didn't know that informed consent was a piece of medicine and that it was folded into what doctors are supposed to do. It's been around since 1957.
Oh, wow. That's wow. And I knew 1 and I knew 2 and I kind of knew 3. I did not know 4 because I feel like doctors have never said, hey, look, you're going to have a hell of a time trying to get off this medication. Have fun. Good luck. You're going to take it for 2 months. All right. 10 years later. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So you actually, a doctor should be able to tell you those 4 things, including
Yes.
what it's going to be like to come off the medication.
Yes, they should. And that's what, so what I do.
So, and let me just stop you. Is that part of the Hippocratic Oath?
No, it's not, but it is part. What I did for this article and for myself was to go directly to the American Psychiatric Association and look up what they had written about informed consent. And that is one of the parameters that they're supposed to talk about. That's in their own guidelines.
If you asked 1 out of 5 people, they probably wouldn't know that.
No,
I don't think they would know that.
They don't. I have a friend who lost her husband very suddenly 1.5 years ago, and she's had a very difficult time, and she's been in and out of hospitals. And most recently she went in and she was afraid they were going to change her drugs again, which is what they usually do when you go into a hospital. And I said to her, you don't have to do anything, but if the doctor pushes you, be sure you get informed consent. And she said, what is that? So people don't know about this.
No, I didn't know.
My experience, and most of the people I talk to, they're not getting it from their doctors.
So let's go back to Rob Wypon's consent is not required. If that is a thing, then are people who are not doing, if your consent is not required and there's informed consent, isn't there a disconnect there?
Yes, there is. But I think one of the reasons that I've been an activist for a while, but I think I'm getting to be a fiercer activist is because I can't think of any other medical specialty where you say to the doctor, I don't want to take this drug, and they force you to take it anyway. If you have cancer and you go to an oncologist and the oncologist says, well, I want you to have surgery. And then first I want you to do chemo, then have surgery, then radiation. And you say, after you say, I'm going to go home and read about this and I'll get back to you. And you come back and you say, I don't want chemo, but I'll let you do the surgery. And I don't want radiation. That doctor cannot make you then do chemo and have radiation. They can't make you do that. But a psychiatrist can make you take drugs that you don't want to take. And when you just try to discuss it with the doctor, they can say that you don't have any insight into your condition. So it's a complete dismissal of who you are as a living, breathing person. And I feel so strongly about this because at one point my psychiatrist was diagnosing me as bipolar, which I certainly am not. But anyway, they were diagnosing me that way. And he put me on Depakote. And Depakote made me feel like I had a soaking wet army blanket on my personality, and my hands shook, and gained 50 pounds, and my memory was shot. I had word finding problems. I couldn't think of words. It was awful.
There's a horrible feeling being on Depakote for me. Yes.
Yeah. And, and when I complained about it, I didn't have insight into my condition. That's ridiculous. That is ridiculous.
Yeah. I feel like there is such a power dynamic when talking about trying to advocate for your own treatment. You can feel really small. And if you're in a hospital in a locked setting, oh my God, you can feel way more smaller.
Yes.
And it can get even worse from there. So it is kind of a scary power dynamic and power shift. But it's nice to know that there's a community like Mad in America that has, writers like you in it, that, offer this shift in how people can, look at psychiatry. And it's people like you, Ann, who write for Mad in America and give us this information like informed consent. No, I didn't know. Like, I knew one, they had to tell you what it was. But I didn't know they had to tell you how to get off the meds, because I've never had that conversation before. So I think that's really brilliant that, you brought that out there. Let me ask you a question. Subtle shift. You've written poetry, you've written a memoir, and now this seems to be like an expose, how did you shift from poetry, memoir to like expose?
Well, I taught at the University of Maryland for 5 years. I taught professional writing. So I learned a lot about how to put an argument together, because I had to teach my students how to put an argument together and how to effectively work with your audience and convince your audience, and what kind of appeals you could make to people. So even though I was teaching all that, I was also learning all that for myself, and I was informing my own writing as well, because I also do advocacy writing, like letters to the editor and things like that. So I think it's been interesting for me to start out as a poet and to have published 3 poetry books and then do the memoir, because I haven't done long forms. I had not done long form storytelling. So I wrote that memoir about 5 times. I worked with one editor, and she put me through all kinds of paces, and then I tried to sell the book and I couldn't sell it. And I said, if I don't sell it within a year, I'm going to go to a book doctor. So I didn't sell it. I went to a book doctor, and it was a person who specialized in writing memoirs. And she read the manuscript and told me, you need to make it more story. You have too much, you have pieces that are story and pieces that read like a what do you call it? Like a textbook article. She said, that's not the way you need to do a memoir. I want you to read Joan Didion's memoir, look at how she folded in research. I want you to read this book called Blueprinting Your Bestseller, which tells you to cut up your whole manuscript into all these different scenes and then reorganize it. And I'm like, okay. So I did that, and I completely rewrote the book, and I wove my story along with my mother's story, so they were parallel, because we both experienced many of the same things. And then every couple chapters I would put in the research, and I would say, because I found my father's records for 30 years of my mother's illness. So I could say mom struggled with anxiety and she was taking these medications. They gave her amphetamines and barbiturates and antidepressants, and the antidepressants and the stimulants caused anxiety
Of
and
course they did.
insomnia.
Of course they did.
So, and they knew that. I mean, I did a deep dive on this. I went all the way back. I read about the history of amphetamines, the history of barbiturates.
Oh, wow.
I was
Yeah.
really well informed. I read a whole book about the Nazis and amphetamines, and a book called The Age of Anxiety. So I really did a deep dive so that I could speak with authority about these medications. And I realized that my poor mother honestly never had a chance because they were chemically inducing these things, which is why she started drinking. I believe she was self-medicating to deal with the anxiety and to deal with the insomnia.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about putting a methamphetamine, I mean, yeah, methamphetamine and an antidepressant together, yeah, you're going to get anxiety. If you put any antidepressant with, if you put a bunch of meds together, you're going to get anxiety. That's like your concoction for anxiety. I really do feel like that is, and and then all of a sudden you're not sleeping. All of a sudden, oh my God, you're manic. And it's like, come on, guys. Like, can you realize that these medications are affecting each other and that this stuff is all relative? Do we have to keep on saying that there's disorders and illnesses and diseases, that it is not completely, I don't know. I feel like it's just such I just feel like it's so overwhelmingly hypocritical, and everyone's put in these boxes, but I also feel that mental illness is mental health, mental illness. I'll say mental illness in the DSM-5. It's a huge spectrum, and I feel like one could be another one. For instance, I was diagnosed ADD. Where did that go when all of a sudden I was diagnosed bipolar and the ADD just vanished? Like, where did that go? Right. So I feel like, how can one, oh no, you're wrong, that doesn't exist anymore. I know you're having trouble concentrating, but you also are, but maybe that medication caused the bipolar. It's like, what is happening here? So I feel like there's definitely a disconnect, and there's stuff like this book that talks about the over medication of, and how, like Crash, how you just have too much in all regards, whether it's pain meds or psych meds, and or it's other books, or it's Mad in America. But this stuff needs to be talked about. People need to know about this stuff.
Yes.
And it's been a real pleasure having you on the show. I know that we talked for a little while now. I would like to ask you one more question. First off, let me ask you where we can find your book, or where can we find your book currently right now, Ann?
Okay. You can find my book at bookshop.org, Amazon.com, and barnesandnoble.com. And here's the cover.
Oh, it's beautiful. Love that cover.
Thank you. Yeah, I do too. I think it just says everything right there.
It really does. It just illustrates exactly what that book is. That illustrates exactly what you're trying to convey there. So you heard where Ann can get your book. And what do you have a website, or is there somewhere people can find you, follow you?
Yes, I have a website. It's www.annbrackenauthor.com.
And I would also like to ask about Little Patuxent Review. Are you accepting submissions right now? And how can my poets who want to take a shot at the Little Patuxent Review send their stuff to you?
Oh, okay. We're going to put out another issue in June, and then we'll be closed for about a month. And I believe submissions will start again either July 1st or August 1st. But we have a website, littlepatuxentreview.org.
Awesome.
And yeah, and they also put out a call in Poets and Writers magazine.
Oh, this is fantastic. All right. You got a lot of information, listeners, to check out Ann Bracken. Please check out Crash, a memoir of over-medication and recovery. Last question, Ann, are you reading anything right now? And what's a book that you would recommend?
Well, Right now, I'm reading Your Consent is Not Required by Rob Wypond. But one book I recommend for absolutely everybody, if you haven't read it, read Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker. It will change your life as far as being able to understand what's really happening when you experience depression or anxiety or ADHD. It gives you a very full picture, a very different picture from what we're presented with in the mainstream media.
And thank you for being on the show. It was a real pleasure having you on the show. I know we covered a lot of stuff. Check out Ann Bracken's Crash, a Memoir of Overmedication Recovery. Check out her website, and definitely, if you're a poet, send your stuff to Little Patuxent Review. And thanks for being on the show. And if you can hold on for 1 second, I'd love to talk to you after the show. So my name is Jason Wright. This has been Oddball Show, and we'll see you real soon.
If you liked what you heard in this episode, learned something new, and want to stay up to date on what's going on with Oddball Show, please consider liking this episode and leaving a review. Subscribe to Oddball Show on YouTube, Buzzsprout, or wherever you get your podcasts. And check out oddballmagazine.org for more fascinating stories, poetry, and art. Thanks for listening.